I've been really lucky to have quite a few amazing mentors in my life. And having done a PhD, there's supervisors that have been critical to all of this. But I think really it's a community, if I could say that, is rather than one person. And for me, that's women in BIM. That's something I'm very, very passionate about. And I think that's because it's like-minded people that can get together, and there's some superstars in that community alone.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Buildings 2.0. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Melanie Robinson, Associate at Okana. Melanie, thanks for chatting with me today.
Thank you for having me.
Let's dive in. First of all, tell us, how did you first fall in love with BIM?
Sure. So I am an architectural technologist. And when I was at university, there was a presentation given. I can't remember the details, but there was a presentation given where they showed this school. It wasn't the most glamorous of projects. It was just a school. But it got me thinking. It was like, wow, this technology is amazing. I'm able to understand how it's built. And I was just a little student. I didn't know how buildings worked at all. And that ability to understand what was on screen really resonated with me, because all of a sudden it made things click in my brain. And I was like, well, if that's making me feel like that, that's a lot of power to put out into industry. And so yeah, that's how I really fell in love with it. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than just the pretty 3D model, but that certainly is the bit that got me through the door.
In the process of becoming a student to a professional, was there any person, either in your career as a professor or in the profession, that served as most influential for you?
I've been really lucky to have quite a few amazing mentors in my life. And having done a PhD, there's supervisors that have been critical to all of this. But I think really it's a community, if I could say that, is rather than one person. And for me, that's women in BIM. That's something I'm very, very passionate about. And I think that's because it's like-minded people that can get together, and there's some superstars in that community alone. And it would be incredibly unfair for me to try and name one, because they're all fantastic people. But yeah, it's the community of women in BIM.
What do you find are some of the factors that you look for when either hiring or looking to partner with someone in a role for BIM?
I think this might be controversial. The technical is the easy bit. What I mean by that, it's the easiest to learn bit. What I really look for is that spark, is that client engagement, is that ability to talk to the client and help them understand what all of this means. And I think that's why looking at that school really resonated with me, was because I understood it and I could use this method to help people understand what I was trying to communicate. So when I'm hiring people, it's really looking for that personable attitude, that person that breaks it all down to plain language, doesn't go into data schemas, albeit that knowledge is really important. And I'm not, denying that. It's the ability to translate that. And I've always said we're translators at our core. We take what the client wants and asks for. We do our magic, we work our magic on it, we translate it into that data schema language. We validate that data schema when it comes back, and then it gets given to the client. But the client ultimately doesn't need to know as much as we need to know about how all the nuts and bolts work. They just want to know what they're getting at the end of the day. So yeah, that's what I look for, is more than just the technical.
I want to role play a little bit with you. And so let's say I'm an owner operator of multiple locations around the country, and I'm looking to go from 99 locations to 100. And I want to consider what it might mean to digitize my spaces. I don't know what the heck that means, but I know someone's told me, like, I need to think about BIM. I need to hire maybe some architects or someone, I don't know, but help me understand, what do I need to know if I want to digitize my spaces? Why does it matter for me? And what are the different ingredients and folks that I would need to connect and put together to even start thinking, perhaps, like, how to even start? I know it's a loaded question, but help me kind of maybe provide a framework as an owner operator who's looking to open up their 100th location, as well as understand what do I have in the other 99.
Sure. So I think that's where digital can do a lot, right? Is understanding even what you've got. You'd be surprised how many owner operators don't actually know what they have. And what I mean by that is you can maybe say you've got 10 schools, 12 hospitals, etc., typologies of buildings, but you don't know what they're made of. You don't know how they've been constructed. You don't know when they were constructed. Like the information has traditionally been horrendous. So digital in that first instance for those 99 is about looking at capturing and storing and then managing and interpreting the information in a way that is usable and brings value to you as an owner operator. Obviously that involves some surveying, it involves some, that data capture and what that looks like and how far you want to go into the geometry of that, whether you need it just in 2D, which is still absolutely valid, or whether you want it to be in more interpretable 3D world where it's much more easy to understand. There's a lot of different ways you can go about it. And that for me is the power of digital. And I always say that, unless delivery teams are working with pen and paper and a drawing board, we're all doing some form of digital. And we're all doing some form of BIM in that instance because we're all using a computer to design our buildings now. It's just how you communicate to what level of detail you need that information in. So like I said, if you don't need it in 3D, that's still valid. It's just setting out those expectations and those parameters and being able to make sure that your team, whoever your team is, are capable of meeting those expectations as well. And I think that's going to be critical to any of this is just ascertaining or assessing what your supply chain is capable of providing you, assessing where those gaps are and how you can bridge those gaps. And might be plugging ourselves a little bit, but for me, that's what a good BIM manager can also help with is that upskilling element. Maybe it's existing supply chain needing to come up to a certain level, or maybe it's, filling or bridging any gaps like clash detection. That's something that, is a supplementary service that a BIM manager can fulfill. It's looking at that. So when you're looking at your 100th, then it all depends on whether you want it to be a new build, in which case you've got blank canvas. And what is it that you want from this blank canvas? Like if you could think of what your dream digital version of a building could look like, then let's specify and let's get a design team and a contractor who can deliver to that. If it's an existing building, then let's try and figure out how best to capture that information. But again, using the concrete set of requirements at the start that say, okay, I want to capture this part of the building to this level of detail, but I'm not too fussed about that part. So how do we get to that, and how do we build that picture of requirements?
How do you help me navigate the question of, perhaps I might say as an owner, I've got some old PDFs. I mean, they're in 2D, but they're good enough. They're probably out of date. Why do I need to digitize? Why would I need to go and go through kind of a new process? How do I think about that paradigm?
Don't get me wrong, I do think there are roles for PDFs. We'll always need record information. However, it's so hard to interpret and interrogate data that's held within something like a PDF. And that's where digital really has power. We talk about it's no different to me from an Excel compared to a database. Excel isn't a database. It's hard to you can write some clever formulas, and that's great, but it's hard to really derive meaning and value from that data set if you can't link it to other pieces of information that reside elsewhere in the building. So it's really challenging what you as an owner operator want to achieve from your building. And the example I always use is net zero, sustainability, very big topics at the moment. How is your built environment contributing to your ability to meet those goals? And the answer oftentimes is, I don't know, because it's not measured and it's not captured. Or if it is captured, it's held within a PDF document that is really difficult to find. You've got to open up all your different attachments in your emails to be like, I swear someone, once upon a time did a calculation and it was written somewhere, but can't quite figure out where it was. And it's just being able to call up that information as quickly as possible, regardless of whether it's live data or whether it's, as I say, just a calculation that someone wrote once upon a time. It's all got to be searchable. It's all got to be pulled together so that it is, really, really drawing on that value that is brought to the client.
To double click on this, while BIM is nothing new, the idea that buildings can be databases, like as an owner, I love the idea, but like, what does this actually mean? What I know is that, for example, I have folks around me from that are focused on, acquisitions, maybe the design and construction side, maybe facilities management. Help me understand like what buildings as a database means. And like, all I know is I got a bunch of folks asking me a bunch of different types of questions about my building.
So I think that's what's really exciting about our industry at the minute is that there's quite a lot of solutions and softwares that are coming on the market now that almost overlay that database so that you can pull on the relevant pieces of data and pull it together to draw meaning from it. And that's the benefit for me of the BIM methodology is that it's given at its real basic level a foundational database which tells you which assets are called what and are allocated where in the building. That's it at the fundamental level. Now, don't get me wrong, you can add in lots and lots and lots of different parameters and data into that model, but at real minimal level, that's what it's providing you. As soon as you apply like that layer, that ability to interrogate and ask questions of that data by way of software tools or even something that you can quite arbitrary that can be built on top of that data set, then all of a sudden you can, as I say, align it to your business objectives and really start drawing value from it. I'm mentioning that term quite a lot, but that's something I'm really, really passionate about. As I think one of the biggest challenges we face within the built environment is that any one building, like the one I'm sitting in, the one you're sitting in, has so much information about it that as owner operators, you really do need to challenge yourselves on what is it you need to know, because there's no end to how much information you could get about your building. You could put sensors on every single window, door, chair, table, etc. But it costs money, and how do you store that data and how do you make sure it's secure? There's lots of, costs to it. So it's balancing that with, well, do I need to have a sensor attached to my table? What on earth is that doing for me? Whereas, if you've got sensors on your windows, then all of a sudden, because you've got to measure how often they're opened because you're in a sensitive environment that needs to have a certain amount of airflow, or air changes per hour or whatever. It's really making sure that you are aware of what you want to achieve out of your built environment.
Help me understand. So data in and of itself is this ginormous bag that I guess we need to unpack. So you mentioned things like sensors on windows and what are maybe how do I understand the kinds of data that as an owner operator I can even start? Like how do I start to categorize? Like you mentioned things like kind of carbon as well as like performance of windows. Like how do I think
Sure.
of this?
So what I can do is take you through what my workflow is, because this is what I do in my day job is I work with clients. First of all, I figure out who they are, because that's really important, and what drives them. But then the second bit is going, right, well, let's figure out what your use cases are for a digital building. And as I say, there might be commonalities between a lot of them, like as I say, sustainability, net zero goals, etc. There might be, oh, we've been struggling with reactive maintenance. Like, isn't all of our maintenance is reactive? I want to flip it to be more predictive, so that we're not wasting time on things that ultimately can be avoided. Well, all of a sudden you're building a series of use cases there that you think, okay, well, what assets do you want to focus on in terms of flipping that reactive to predictive? What's critical to the running of your building? It might be your air conditioning system. It probably isn't your door. It's looking then at the asset level. And then once you figure out what's critical, what's not critical, you can then get into that level of really challenging what that data is. And there's different layers of how we approach data definition, down to fidelity. So what I mean by that is how or how real time, I guess, that data is. So, there's still value in static data, like who the manufacturer of the air conditioning is. That won't change until you change the air conditioning unit. Or is it something more live, like sensor information that's coming through? And that might be related to how often it's being reviewed as well. So when the guy with the wrench comes around, he's pressing a button that says, right, I've reviewed it now, and that's important information, because then you can start tying it to your predictive maintenance, saying, well, let's say, we found out that it takes a guy on average 50 times to look at a piece of equipment before it starts to show signs of failure. well, this one's on 47th, so maybe we should be doing something about this. So that's how we work through it, is really starting at that high level of what is it that you really care about? What are your pain points? What are you wasting money on? And then drilling down further and further and further until you get really specific about what data you need on what asset and what objective that is fulfilling. So hopefully that's kind of giving you a bit of a framework in terms of how you think about it.
You mentioned like a fascinating concept where it's like I can ask a question of my building and I can instantly know it. Now, the concept is fascinating. I'd have to imagine everyone would want that kind of future, or at least if you're, owning and operating a building. What's keeping us from getting there? Like if we wanted to just bring buildings online in mass right now, like what's keeping us from moving at scale?
The answer is always going to have to be money to a certain extent. And I don't think it's unwarranted, but what I will say is there's been a real lack of value demonstration, which I think is a shame. I'm not quite sure what the reason is. I think we are quite a competitive industry for a start. The process I go through, with my clients, I don't necessarily want other people to take that and start doing the same with them, because that's my IP. So why would I shout about what I'm doing and what value it's bringing? Well, this is why fundamentally is, clients want to be told how much money they're saving. It all comes back to lack of risk or risk mitigation and how much extra money they can have in their pocket. But until we've got those figures, it's a hard thing to sell because digital has this extra vision to it. It's like that other thing that we've got to think about is that bolt on. We just want a building to be built. Like, why does it have to be digital? And like, well, because it saves you X, Y, and Z. Well, show me. I think the other thing is there is a reticence as well around digital. We hear horror stories about banks being hacked, and we hear about security threats, and we hear about corruption in the cloud. We've all lost a digital photo, because it's become corrupt for whatever reason. And I think that's never going to help because, you don't want your whole building to all of a sudden become lost in the ether because it's held digitally. So I think there's various levels to it. I think that one's a bit easier in a way, just through better education. We're all interacting with digital every single day of our lives. We're doing this call over Zoom. We're going to come off it and take a phone call on our phone. We're going to go home and watch a TV on our smart TV and, on Netflix or whatever. Like, we all use digital. So I think that will, those concerns will ease over time. But the money element doesn't necessarily change unless we start really demonstrating how much value it is actually bringing.
You mentioned something that really resonates with me, which is, sometimes not everything is a technology problem. Sometimes there is just some fundamental like misalignment, right? In the industry that on the one hand, we have these, time clocked kind of emission goals that we need to hit at scale. That's not necessarily waiting for an owner to go and start a project and start a proper bid process and have 3 or 4 different consultants and this kind of very reactive approach. Meanwhile, we have to kind of proactively, if you will, bring these buildings online. Like, do you have any sense as to maybe examples as to exciting business models that rather than this kind of traditional like wait until a client comes to you, maybe there's some sort of more proactive way that firms could
Sure.
start thinking about that?
So interestingly, there's different ways that we've approached it in the past. And one of them, it sounds really simple, but undertaking a pilot study is really important and testing what your requirements are. Like, what is actually bringing you value? And one way you can do that is if there is a building being delivered to, let's say, a BIM methodology. So you're getting that real basic database that we were talking about, is what initiatives can we start applying on top of that BIM model that means we can start interpreting that data a lot quicker or a lot easier, and just real bite-sized chunks of getting into that world. And it's it's underrated, but for me, having a good document management system, in itself is a really good start, because having something that has a structured naming convention that means you can just quickly type in what you're looking for and it pulls up. is going to be the fundamental first step for of a lot of clients. And that doesn't have to be necessarily anything fancy. It could just be a really well configured SharePoint system or something, that clients already have some sort of access to because their business runs on some form of document management system. So they just need to bring their building information into that as well. So there's a lots of little like piecemeal steps that clients can take. And I think it's the key there is measurement. Measure, measure, measure again, right? So every single initiative that you want to roll out is think about what you want to get out of it and the return on investment. And let's say your pain point, as I mentioned earlier, is reactive maintenance. Are you measuring how much is reactive maintenance? If not, start measuring how much maintenance is reactive. And then when you start applying new initiatives such as being able to find information quicker, which reduces your work order time, all of a sudden, you're starting to get some really good measurements that say, oh, actually, this is a good thing to do. But it doesn't have to be anything big. As I say, it can just be a good document management system, which means you're finding your instruction manual on how that air conditioning unit is run. That's how I would approach it.
A few rapid fire questions. So kind of keeping in the spirit of role playing, I'm an owner. And, one thing about this BIM stuff is that there's a ton of acronyms. I hear BIM, I hear VDC, I hear LOD, LOA. Like maybe break this down for me. Explain why should I, as a, say, owner operator with a real estate team that manages several locations, why do I care about LOD? Like, what does this mean for me?
That's why I advocate plain language so often. Is when you hear yourself going, oh, have you defined your EIR and your OIR and your PIR and your AIR? And people look at you and go, what on earth are you talking about? And that's why when I speak about pain points, it's about things like reactive maintenance, because everyone knows what reactive maintenance is. But if I said, oh, you need an LOD 450 on that air conditioning because that, people are like, no, what? So you need to take it back and down to, again, what is that data that you are needing? Oh, I need the serial number because that's what links it to my CMMS system, which tells me what the maintenance regime is on it. All of a sudden you're speaking their language. So yeah, I think we've done ourselves a disservice in this BIM world by going down a rabbit hole of acronyms. But if we just take it back a second and really tune into what a client is telling us, and again, that's what a good BIM manager should be doing is really getting to know that client and know what language they speak.
Another acronym is IoT. How do I think about BIM versus IoT? Sometimes they're spoken about in the same sentence. I often hear them kind of blurred as like digital twin. What are these? Like, how do I think about these two different things?
So the way we define it within Okana is the BIM model is a digital snapshot in time, where at the point of handover, you have this replica of what that building is representing at that point in time. IoT is added onto that replica to provide a real-time input into how that building is actually, living, reacting to the real world. And feeding back into that BIM model is when it becomes a digital twin. So if that BIM model doesn't ever get updated and doesn't have any interaction with any external influences, and it's not helping us make decisions about our building, it is not a digital twin. As soon as we start making use of tools such as IoT to bring changes back into the model and, as I say, make changes back the way into the real time, then that's when it becomes a digital twin.
London is often referred to, or just the UK in general is often referred to as like more of a forward-leaning space where BIM is actually flourishing as compared to, say, even here in the States or in other places. What do you attribute that to?
I think early adoption. We've had the benefit, if you will, of we had the concept of standards pretty early, and the standards were what drove the mandate for government projects here to be all completed using BIM methodology. And then since those standards have become the international standards. So we've got quite a few years building up to those international standards becoming a thing, whereas other countries don't have that necessarily that context of the standards as we have. So that's put us in good stead. I wouldn't say we've got it completely right. There's lots of lessons learned, and I think, there's quite a few countries that come to mind that potentially could leapfrog where we're at as an industry because there's, even the government mandate wasn't as successful as it could have been. Now, for what reason, we're not entirely sure. For me, it comes back to that lack of measurement again. Why did this money get spent on this mandate when, how much did it actually save? There was figures thrown around for a while, like 25% reduction in cost or whatever. Well, show us the figures and then maybe we'll try this BIM thing. So, but no, don't get me wrong, I think we're in an exciting time as an industry, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens next with the UK. I'm really excited to see what happens elsewhere. I'm doing a job in Canada at the minute, and it's been absolutely fascinating to see their interpretation of the standards and how that process is going, and in the embracing of open standards as well. So not tying into proprietary systems. The hospital that I'm working on is due to be handed over in 2030. So, it made sense to us to specify something that meant that it was quite robust and future proof. That meant that, we were drawing on those lessons learned from what we've seen in the UK, where, this open standard thing has been a thing for quite a while. So yeah, it's really exciting. I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens next.
As a young architect, I remember kind of starting as a junior designer, and I was one of the lucky few that at a large firm, they were like, a group of folks need to learn Revit, so let's just choose this group here. But it always felt like, there's the designers and then there's like the BIM folks.
Yeah.
Um, is that changing? Does that need to change? I guess in the context of maybe traditional like architecture and engineering firms?
I think it is changing. There was a comment I made earlier about unless you're drawing with pen and paper, you're doing some form of digital design. And I think we need to embrace that ethos more. We still see the BIM people sat in the corner in the office who deal with the data and the Revit and, everything else. But I think there's definitely been a shift to we need to think about this earlier. We need to start documenting what we're doing in BIM execution plans. We need to start thinking about how this is all being handed over to the client and how they're going to use this information. So I definitely think it's changing. Not to say that there can't be more done. I think we're all learning and it will all keep evolving. And soon there'll be the AI guy sat next to the BIM guy, and then there'll be the Internet of Things guy sat next to the AI guy, sat next to the BIM guy. So I think we'll always have that to a certain extent because you'll always need specialisms, but we need to make sure that they're at the table having the same conversations and understanding what's going on with the design of the building.
So you brought it up, not me, but yet another acronym, AI. So
Yeah.
I'm sure you've been asked about this once or twice, but in the context of BIM and buildings of databases, layers of IoT, how does AI change the game or add to what
Oh
we've
my
already been
goodness.
talking about?
It came out of nowhere, right? It all of a sudden exploded out of the blue. But I've seen it be used for quite a few things now. So from an architectural design perspective, we've been seeing it help a lot in the problem solving world, especially with plugins via Revit. We've been seeing, more automation of more the mediocre tasks, such as door schedules, etc., and AI lending its hand to that because it's a repetitive task. But on the flip side, with owner operators, we've been seeing a lot of interest in chatbots used to interrogate the information. And as we spoke about earlier, that buildings are really complicated. Any building is really complicated in terms of how much information it holds. So, owner operators are really starting to think, well, how can we access this information quicker without, even clicking a few buttons, which digital helps us do, but why can't we just get straight to the source and have a look to see whether AI can support us with that, with chat GPT especially, and building of chat of GPTs anyway. I think there's a lot that we can do with the tools already out there. So where that goes is next is again, that's really exciting. We're just at this really exciting point in our industry.
One of my favorite sayings comes from Picasso, where he says art critics really spend their time talking about meaning and purpose, but when you get together with a group of artists, they'll just ask each other, like, where can I find the cheapest paint? Right. And so to kind of like ask you about like some
Yeah.
of the nitty gritty, like I'm really curious, like day to day, I imagine you're like, engaging with a ton of different software stacks and tools and software. What are some that stand out to you as like, I need these, 3 or 5 different tech stacks and software, like to kind of stitch together my workflow?
Interesting question. And the reason I say that is because I'm really quite passionate about remaining agnostic. So hence why I've spoken about open standards and even ChatGPT as an example. So I think anything that can support and deal with open data schemas is something that is going to be fundamental. And now, don't get me wrong, a lot of technology on the market does that, but we've got to be aware of those that don't or could potentially flip. And I think an interesting case study's just come out. I'm not avoiding your question, don't worry. But an interesting case study's just come out about Adobe and the clause in the terms and conditions. I don't know whether you've seen that,
No.
where they've recently changed it so that anything that is dealt with within Adobe is the product of Adobe. And obviously that's made people go, that's not good. I don't want my work to be the product of Adobe. It's my work. And I think that's the same nervousness applies with any software that is used by us as well. Is our buildings. We don't want to give our buildings to some software company but fundamentally, yeah, lose autonomy over our own data. So we've got to be really careful about what we specify and what helps us in our workflow. And I think part of the challenge from a BIM management perspective is keeping abreast of what tools and technologies are out there on the market and what is best served to that project. You'll always have your favorites. If I had to say them, Celibri is something that we're using a lot of at the moment. BIM Collab is another one where being able to track through the issues. Revitso is another one that we see a lot of. And what's really interesting with all of these tools is that problem solving aspect of getting data to flow in between the various tools so that there's no data loss, that it's all preserved, that it works bi-directionally as well. So you're not sending information to one tool and then having to change it in the original tool and then having to re-upload it to, so yeah, really interesting. But those 3 are probably the ones that I'm starting to see more and more and more of, as well as your Revit. Revit will always have a place, won't it?
No, this has been really, really fun. I could probably double click and spend an hour just on any one of these subjects, open source, on BIM standards, on even your early career. We absolutely have to do a part 2. If folks want to follow your work or just kind of reach out to you, what's the best way to do that?
So I'm quite active on LinkedIn. Yeah, that's where I tend to post a lot of what I get up to. Otherwise, I guess you call it X now, Melanie Jane 25. So give me a follow on there, and I'll promise I'll try and speak more on what I'm doing, less about my dog.
Thanks so much, and we're going to talk soon.
Thank you ever so much.